know if you know this, but there's a huge debate in gardening, and that is in-ground or raised beds. And people have some very strong opinions about which one is better and which one we should be using. Today, I'm gonna dive into the nuts and bolts of each one. We're gonna talk about the pros and the cons of each type of bed, and I'm gonna give you a ton of information to help you make an informed decision about which one is right for you. I'm also gonna share my personal preference. So let's dive into it. So let's start with some of the benefits and some of the important things to note when it comes to growing in ground. There are a lot of people that will say, we've been growing in ground for thousands of years. Like, you don't need to add a raised bed. Like, that's just fancy and a waste of money. Put a seed in the ground, it's gonna grow. There are a lot of people who will tell you that. There are a lot of people who tell you tilling makes sense for them, and that they'll grow in rows and they'll monocrop. It can make sense, right? Like, let's say we have a really large area and we're gonna grow a lot of a crop. Well, putting it in the ground makes sense. If you're growing something like corn, putting it in the ground probably makes sense. Using rows in-ground gardening can be incredibly cheap. You don't have to add a lot of soil or amendments. You don't have to bring in a lot of products from the outside. This can go a long way when it comes to self-sufficiency. There are a lot of people who have great success growing in-ground, and they swear by it. They would never go with a raised bed. They like the traditional method of tilling the soil and planting in it. And like I said, you can do this. It's a great option. It saves a ton of money, especially when it comes to your larger crops. This is probably going to be the way to go. When it comes to growing in ground, you can do a lot over time to really improve the quality of the soil and help the natural ecosystem that is in place. You can continuously grow in that space, add amendment fertilizers, compost, use chop and drop methods, all types of different things you can do and really make that soil something beautiful and something beneficial to the ecosystem over time. And over time, you will reduce the amount of weeds that you have to pull if you continue to maintain that space. So to recap, some of the pros of growing in ground is you can grow a lot more, especially if you have a lot of space. You can grow a lot larger items. You can grow things like corn a lot easier in your in-ground beds. It also saves money. You're not gonna have the money investment in growing in ground that you would have in raised beds. So those are some of the main points, the main benefits of growing in ground. And you're improving that soil over time. And eventually, like I said, you're gonna have that decreased weed pressure and you're gonna have beautiful, healthy soil that you didn't have to spend a lot of money to cultivate. But let's talk about some of the disadvantages of growing in ground and some of the reasons why people chose to go with raised beds in the first place. So some of the possible disadvantages of growing in ground, the very first one being the weed pressure that you're gonna deal with. Especially if you till the soil, you're going to deal with a ton of weeds that first season, that second season. There's gonna come a point where, like I said, that weed pressure decreases over time. But at first, you're gonna have to do a lot of work to get those weeds out of that space. And this can be really discouraging and really disheartening, especially for a new gardener, and especially like in the heat of the summer. Do you have hours and hours to go outside and weed your garden? If you don't, this is one of the reasons why people started going with raised beds. One of the issues with growing in ground could be that you have poor soil. Now, for me, I have grown in ground, and one of my other videos, I kind of explained how I grew kind of on the side of a hill, and I put some in-ground garden beds. I had really sandy soil, and I had like a slope to that space. So one of the things that happened was I had soil that drained really quickly and lost nutrients really quickly. And this was a problem for me growing in ground. I've heard other people had issues when it came to compaction. I've not really dealt with a lot of compaction issues, but you could deal with a lot of compaction issues. You could deal with very poor draining soil. You could deal with heavy clay soil that it's hard for your roots to break up and penetrate that soil. And you have to do a lot of work to really cultivate that space. You could deal with soil that, like mine, was really sandy, leached out the nutrients, and water just runs right through it. So you're constantly watering throughout the season to maintain a consistent moisture level. Those are all things you might deal with in-ground gardening because you don't have as much control over the soil. There are a lot of things you can do, obviously, to improve this. You can add amendments, you can add compost, you build up that soil over time. You make that soil more fertile over time by fertilizing it, adding compost, adding organic matter, allowing that to break down. You could mulch that area really well, really heavily. All of those things are going to kind of help you be able to control the soil that's in that in-ground space a little bit more. But these are things that you may deal with. And knowing how to navigate that poor soil can be frustrating and it can be overwhelming. And you may get into a situation where you're growing and then find out, oh my gosh, I've got some drainage issues that I really got to deal with, and I've already got plants growing in it. What do I do? This has been my experience. That first year growing in ground, I have not had very good success. Year 2, year 3, year 4 was much better once I'd got that space established. So something to keep in mind when it comes to growing in ground. Another disadvantage for growing in ground is you got to get really low to the ground to work in that space. And because you're doing a lot more weed pulling, especially that first year, this can be really hard on your knees. This can be really hard on your back. And it's something definitely to keep in mind. Now, I didn't realize how much work actually growing in ground was going to be when I started my first garden, but I quickly found that there were a lot of hours spent weeding. There were a lot of hours spent cultivating the soil and adding amendments. There was a lot of hours spent watering because I had the issue of it draining out too quickly. There were a lot of hours spent just trying to protect my plants, because there were a lot more pests, which brings me to another disadvantage of in-ground gardening. You're probably going to deal with a lot more pest pressure in ground than you are above ground by growing raised beds. And this is because there's a lot of things that live in that soil. But when you go raised beds, you control the soil more, which we'll talk about. So it reduces the pest pressure at least a little bit. When it comes to raised beds, some of the benefits really relate to being able to control the soil. You know what you're putting into that raised bed, you're cultivating that soil, and you're not using your native soil. So issues that you might have dealt with in ground, like drainage issues or your soil being too sandy, you're not going to have that same problem in your raised bed because you've added soil to that space. You know what that soil is that you're growing in, and you can make it a perfect growing medium right from the start for your plants. You're also going to have a lot less weeds growing in your raised beds because you're getting it up off that soil surface. The weed seeds aren't in that space yet. Now, they will eventually get into that space. Weed seeds blow around, so you are going to have to weed a little bit, but the weed pressure is going to be a lot less than what you would deal with in ground. You're also not going to have as much pest pressure. Now, I touched on this when we were talking about in ground, but as you get the soil up off that surface, you don't have all of the little pest eggs that you had in ground to deal with. You have things that are overwintered and whatever. And so you may have pests in ground that you don't necessarily have in the raised beds. Again, this is at the start, because eventually those pests are going to find your plants. Eventually those pests are going to live in your soil. And if you live in a place like I do in Florida, it is not a matter of if, it is a matter of when. So we just deal with bugs. It's just something we have. And speaking of which, let me know what pests you're battling this year. I'm really gearing up for the vine borers and the squash bugs. They have been my nemesis for the past few years. So let me know what you're dealing with in your garden this year. Let me know if you have some tips and tricks for pest management. Like I said, because I live in Florida, the pests are absolutely crazy here. Another benefit is the added height. So raised beds are a lot easier to work in because they're up off the ground. You can get really tall ones that you can literally stand up and work in. I have these that are like 12-inch. They still raise it up enough that I'm not quite as bent over. I can sit comfortably on the ground and work in my raised beds. But like I said, you can get ones that are really tall and you just stand up and work in those things. So much better for your back and for your knees. Another benefit of the raised beds is that the amendments and the things that you do to the soil stay in that soil longer. Because your beds have sides, because there is structure to it, you don't have as much of the soil being washed away or leached out as you would with in-ground growing. So although there's a higher initial investment, over time, you're actually able to keep that soil healthier, probably with less effort and less money, because you have structure and you have sides and you have some way to keep that soil contained. Let's talk about some of the disadvantages to raised bed, and the elephant in the room being the cost. Raised beds can be really pricey, especially if you're doing a lot of them. You can buy cheap raised bed material. Now, they sell really nice metal raised beds, by the way, and I would definitely encourage you to look into some of the longer term options and some of the nicer ones. But if you want to get some simple raised beds, you can get them for like 50 bucks. But then you're gonna have to put soil in it. You could also build some raised beds with wood very cheaply. I have done this, like almost nothing. You can use used pallets to build your raised beds. You could use some pavers that you had lying around to build raised beds. You could build raised beds literally with almost anything that has height and isn't, harmful or toxic to the soil. Mainly the biggest cost is gonna be the soil. Soil is crazy expensive, especially for good soil. It's hard to believe how much dirt costs. I filled these raised beds and it was over $120, and it's still, to be honest with you, not even completely full. So I'm gonna have to add a few more bags of compost before it's over with. So all total, filling my raised beds is gonna be like 130 bucks. And when you're talking about 5 raised beds, well, that's pretty expensive. And that's exactly what I did here. So that initial cost, that initial investment, can be pretty high. Over time, you're still gonna have to add some compost, some soil. If you buy that or whether you make that, you're still gonna have to add something to that space over time. So there could be a cost with that as well. But again, in ground, you're gonna have to add some amendments, whether it's cost or whether you put your time in to produce those amendments. But the cost is significantly higher when it comes to your raised beds. And that's one of the biggest drawbacks. It's one of the biggest reasons why people kind of avoid the raised beds. The other issue is spacing. You can grow, we can talk about square foot gardening, which I really love, and growing high intensity, high density in your raised beds. And you can get a lot of food and a lot of production out of that. But just to be honest with you, if I was to till up my backyard and put rows in, I'm gonna have a lot more space to grow in than I have by utilizing raised beds. It is just what it is. The way that they take up space and having the paths in between them, and because they're only 8 feet long. Now I could maybe stack them all up, line them down, my garden, but I don't really like the look of that or the idea of that. But for the most part, I could till up this backyard and I could grow more food in this space growing in ground than I can in raised beds. And even using square foot gardening method, even using high intensity spacing and being very mindful of utilizing every inch of the bed. Even with all of that, I could still grow more food in my backyard by tilling it up than by adding my raised beds. And that's just truth. Another disadvantage of raised beds is they could dry out faster. So there's a benefit in that they may warm up sooner in the spring or stay warm a little bit longer in the fall because they're a little bit higher up off the ground. But for the same reason, because the soil is up off the ground, there's gonna be more of a tendency for the soil to dry out quicker than your in-ground garden does. So you may find that you have to water your raised beds more often than you do your in-ground garden bed. You can get away from this by using something like drip or by, soaker hoses and things like that, so you're not having to come out here and manually water. But again, those things cost money. So you may wind up with having to water your raised beds a little bit more often than your in-ground beds. Okay, so my preferred method of growing. I have done in-ground, I have done raised beds, I have done grow bags and pots and containers. I've done all kinds of stuff. But for the sake of this video, do I prefer raised beds or in-ground? The answer to that is raised beds. And the reason is all the things I mentioned. I like to save time. I'm a working mom, I work full time, and I record these videos for you, which takes up a lot of time as well. And you know, and I have kids and all the things. So time is a very precious resource for me. I would rather spend money than I would time. So a lot of times you'll see in these videos, I talk about your free options or your cheap ways of doing things, but then I'll show you how I do it where I spend a little bit of money. And that is just because, like I said, I would rather save time than money. I know that's probably terrible, but that's just me. So because I want to save my time, because I do not want to be weeding all the time, because I want a very aesthetically appealing garden, and raised beds are aesthetically appealing, one of the benefits I didn't mention, but because I want all of those things, I like the raised bed gardens much better. There are times where I will utilize in-ground beds. I may even build some in my backyard before this season is over. We'll see, because there's a lot of uses for them. So I would say it might be best to do both. There are advantages and disadvantages to both, and it depends on what you're growing. If you're gonna grow some corn, you might wanna consider an in-ground bed for that. Potatoes are great in-ground as well, although you can do those in containers. I'm trying that out this year. We'll see how it goes. Leave me a comment down below. Let me know your preferred method. Is it in-ground? Is it raised beds? Is it containers? Are you growing on a balcony? Let me know. I'm gonna leave a video on your screen until the next one comes out. I'm actually gonna leave the video about how I built these raised beds, step-by-step process. So definitely check that one out, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you guys again so much for watching. May your garden be full of grace, and may you be abundantly blessed. We'll see you next time. Bye.